2 years, is that the human rights violations we have asked to look into, the basic responsibility lies with the Tatmadaw. Whether it is not civilian government or other civilians, we found that actually it is basic to the Tatmadaw military strategy, which is called the four-cut strategy, which allows one to use force against the civilian population to intimidate and punish the civilian population as a tactic of war. So this is our finding. Now, one of the tools of that intimidation is sexual violence. It happens even in Kachin or it happens in Shan, but it's egregious in Rakhine, and that's why in the report we say that it might even be an inference of genocide can be taken because of the nature and brutality that took place in the Rakhine. So this report then looks at some of the other issues of sexual violence, other than what was covered in last year's report in depth. First, it looks at issues relating to sexual slavery. It looks at issues relating to the silent issues, such as men and boys, and against the transgender community. It looks at sexual violence and discrimination by the ethnic armed organizations, which is something people don't generally explore. It looks about sexual violence in the context of forced labor. And it also looks at the root causes of sexual violence and the link between that and general discrimination and lack of respect for women in society. If I could quickly just go over these issues, the issue of sexual slavery and sexual violence, for example, as you know, we see this pattern, especially highlighted in our last report, the worst case study being the Tulatoli case, where after attack by ASA, there is what is called these famous clearance operations, where the Tatmadaw come in shooting, people are shot while fleeing. But what is important for us in this report is that the men are separated from the women. The women are then were taken to a house. In this house, they were gang raped in a situation of sexual slavery for days, and later they burnt the house down. We were able to, some of the women in the act of burning managed to escape and cross the boundary to Cox's Bazar, and we were able to interview. Our teams were in Cox's Bazar, and I put together, if you look at the report from last year, you will see how they put together that whole episode, not only for the women, but all the men and boys. So sexual slavery is an important part of this, is something we wanted to highlight. Then the violence against men and boys. This is, in a way, a new area, generally in international law, but primarily in police stations and prisons. I myself interviewed one young man who was in Batadong prison. He said the political and Rohingya prisoners were kept separately. They were a special treatment, and they were subject to sexual violence. His story was corroborated by other young men kept in Batadong prison. They were also subject to forced nudity, as well as, perhaps for men and boys, the special particular problem of having to witness violence against women in their family. This was also something that was done. It's ultimate, of course, in Asia. It's the ultimate humiliation for women from very conservative societies. We also looked at the issue of violence against transgender people. As you know, in South Asia, despite its conservatism, including in the Rohingya community, the transgender community were a little nomadic, and they were very strong in the entertainment industry. There was a certain kind of autonomy to them. When the violence took place, they were brutally affected and were often the targets of this violence. And life in camps has become very difficult for them. It's very violent for them. And they have taken the nomadic status that the Hijras, as they were at South Asia, is also taken away. We also looked at the issue of forced labor and sometimes sexual violence in the context of forced labor by the Tatmadaw. As you know, the Tatmadaw's other practice is to use the local population to be porters, cooks, seamstresses, And in those practices also, we managed to record cases of sexual violence in that context. And especially interestingly, the ethnic Rakhine, who live in the Rakhine province and also have one serious issue of forced labor, and is one of the issues that the Arakan army that is now active in Arakan Reply has put forward as one of its claims. We have looked at violence and sexual violence by ethnic armed organizations as well. For them, it was not a tactic of war, but as you know, they recruit people from the community, sometimes forced. It is not sometimes voluntary. Women are used as cooks, nurses, cleaners, seamstresses, and sexual violence does take place in those situations, and we have case studies.